stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain? Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place? And a whisper about the Potters. Mr. Dursley came into his living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear? You haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So? Snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I thought maybe it was something to do with, you know, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't. Instead, he said as casually as he could, Their son. He'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, Mrs. Dursley said stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive, as though it were waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all of this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned it over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall was outside and showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed on the next street, nor when 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner. The cat had been watching, appeared so suddenly and silently you'd have thought he'd just have popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen before in Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver on his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept to the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots were unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he did seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for inside his pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer, until the only lights left on the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now, not even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped out the put-outer back inside his cloak and set off down the street towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman, who was wearing square glasses, exactly the shape of the markings the cat had around its eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day, when you could have been celebrating. I must have had a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh, yes, everyone's celebrating all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a bit more careful, but no, even the Muggles have noticed what's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent. I'll bet that was Daedalus Diggle. He never had much sense." "You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. I'm mixing up my voices. "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably, "but that's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless, out on the street in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumors." She threw a sharp, sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he was going to tell her something, but he didn't, so she went on. "A fine thing it would be on the very day you-know-who seems to have disappeared at last. The Muggles found out about us all. I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore?" "It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a lemon drop?" "A what?" "A lemon drop. They're a kind of Muggle sweet I'm rather fond of." "No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for lemon drops. "As I say, even if you-know-who has gone—" "My dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense. For 11 years I have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name. Voldemort." Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 lemon drops, seemed not to notice. "It all gets so confusing if we keep saying who you-know-who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name." "I know you haven't," said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. "But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one you know— Oh, all right. Voldemort was frightened of." "You flatter me," said Dumbledore calmly. "Voldemort had powers I will never have." "Only because you're too, well, noble to use them." "It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs." Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "The owls are nothing next to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying? About why he's disappeared? About what finally stopped him?" It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point that she was most anxious to discuss, the real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day. For neither as a cat nor as a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another lemon drop and did not answer. What they're saying, she pressed on, is that last night Voldemort turned up in Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor is Lily and James Potter that they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. Lily and James? I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. All right, guys, so we're going to pause there. We're about 12 pages into the first chapter. So here are some of the things we know so far. The Dursleys are a pretty ordinary family, and we know that they are related to the Potters, who seem to be very unordinary. We also know that this cat, who turns out to actually be a professor, has been waiting for Dumbledore to come to the Dursleys' house. And we also know that it sounds like the Potters, the parents, have died. And so you're going to have to keep reading to find out how they died and why, and what's going to happen to their son, Harry. So your job this summer is to read Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone with me. The next time we check in a few weeks, I'm going to be jumping in later on in the book, probably somewhere around the time where Harry arrives at Hogwarts. And so I would say that your goal is to get to around chapter 7 by the next time you log on, so that you're ready to listen and talk about some of the things that are going on in this great, amazing, wonderful book. So as always, we are here for you via email if you have any questions about summer homework or need anything. Remember, watching this video and reading along with me does count towards your summer reading minutes, and those minutes help get you as a grade level prizes when they're all added together. And so make sure you're reading every day. Make sure you're logging in to watch these videos and that you're adding up all of the minutes that you read, and so that you can get credit for all that hard work and reading you're doing this summer, because reading every day really does make a difference and really does matter. All right, guys, I hope you're having a wonderful summer. It's great to chat with you all, and have a great day. Bye.